Welcome to the Church Resource, where we talk about the best resources for pastors, leaders, and lay people. I'm your host, Jeff Oliver, and today we are looking at a book that has taken me a little while to get through, and so I've been looking forward to bringing this to you, and I wanted to make sure that I had worked through this book, and it is called Total Truth. It's by Nancy Pearcey. And it has been so helpful to me to understand where she comes from. The subtitle of the book is Liberating Christianity from Its Cultural Captivity. And bonus points there because it has a Van Gogh picture there on the front. That's called The Sower. Van Gogh's a favorite of mine. We might cover him in a future broadcast here, future episode. So that's the book, Total Truth. And I happen to have the study guide edition. I'll get into that in just a little bit and tell you what that's about. But this is something that I have come across here. This is the book review. And so not cheating here, but this is the book review from Tim Challey. So I want to mention him in just a moment as well. And he says about this book, the thesis is, quote, the key to recovering joy and purpose turned out to be a new understanding of Christianity as total truth, an insight that broke open the dam and poured the restoring waters of the gospel into the parched areas of life. That's how he describes this book. And I want to tell you that Nancy Pearcey is an editor-at-large for the Pearcey Report and the Francis Schaeffer Scholar at the World Journalism Institute. She studied at L'Abri, where Francis Schaeffer was in Switzerland, and she has been very much influenced by that. And there are really a few books that I would tell you that have to be on your shelf as we talk about worldview. And what in the world does that mean? First of all, she even talks about that. What is worldview, and why is it really such a scary word for people? Well, all it means is your perspective. This is kind of your guiding philosophy of life. This is how you see things. This is, if you will, the lens through which you view everything. And it has been said that some people, most people, operate under anywhere from 7, 8, 10 different worldviews within the same person, depending on what the topic is, depending on what the news of the day is, whatever whatever we're talking about, that you're going to be coming from a different kind of worldview. You've been indoctrinated in some cases. You've been influenced, certainly been nudged in certain areas by all kinds of things, by all the things that we take in to ourselves and to our minds and to our thought patterns daily. Those things have influenced us whether we realize it or not. So it's something that has just kind of scares people to think about worldview. What in the world is that? So she has looked at this topic of worldview. And I said there are a few resources that we look at as we think about worldview, and one that I would highly recommend, and we might talk about that another day as well, called How Should We Then Live by Francis Schaeffer. And the second would be one that Nancy Pearcey wrote with Chuck Colson called How Now Shall We Live? And that is, as you understand, the titles are very close to the Francis Schaeffer book. And so that is meant to be a kind of a continuation of that book. And this book, Total Truth, is even it's just a practical worldview philosophy text for ordinary people. You think worldview, you think the word philosophy, and it automatically makes people sweat, makes you shudder a little bit, but it shouldn't. I think that the way that Nancy Pearcey breaks that down, the way that Francis Schaeffer does too, by the way, in that book, that it is very accessible. It is the way that she writes it is so down to earth, while explaining very complex principles. The highbrow people who are writing in these worlds of worldview, whether they're coming from a completely atheist worldview or a Christian worldview or something in between, some gray area that there might be. She breaks it down very clearly, practically, and I think it's been a very helpful book for me. Even though it is long, it is very deep, and had to read a couple of pages twice just to make sure that I got the concept there and was understanding what she was getting at. So as she breaks it down, it all begins with creation. So if our origins are ceded to natural causes, in other words, evolution, or what science, as she makes that distinction there, and she says really shouldn't be that much of a distinction between science and our faith science and religion, our truth and our values, they shouldn't be divorced from each other. One should influence the other. There should be a lot of overlap. But this is so that if our origins are kind of given up over to whatever is naturalistic, whatever science says, then a non-theistic worldview is what you end up with. And so that Christianity, your faith, doesn't have much to do with the way that people live. It's just something that you do on the side. It's something that you might do that is, it has to do with your opinions more so than fact. It has to do with your individual choice, and they're non-rational versus a fact that is binding on everyone, that is rational and that is verifiable. So she says, and that's a dichotomy that Francis Schaeffer put forth, and she borrows that, and Schaeffer even said that there shouldn't be that much of a distinction there, and she continues that. So appreciate the work there that she's done. Now, another thing that Tim Challey had said about this book, he says, now I've often, and I totally agree, which is why I'm going to tell you what he says here, I've often lamented the overuse of the term life-changing amongst Christians. It's not unusual, he says, to hear people talk about after conferences, after they've read a book, that they'll say, oh, this was life-changing. You have to go see this. That changed my life. And he says the real measured test, of course, is over time. Has it changed your life really in the next 3 months, 6 months, years later? Is it really life-changing? And he says, now, having established that, I'm not using the term lightly, I think that this book, Total Truth, has been a life-changer for me. And he said we spend collectively millions and millions of dollars as believers, as Christians, who will and spend countless hours as well to look into topics that are reading about Christian living. You know, how should we live? How should we make our homes better? How can we be a better father? How can we be a better church member? How can we, reclaim our masculinity? How can we do this part of life better? Well, he says, but there are so few resources that we really look at that has anything to do with our worldview. So it is something that definitely is worth looking into and something we need to pay attention to. What I want to do is just give you some quotations here, and not to read the whole book to you or even most of the book, because there's a lot. But I want to give you some ideas of just some of the truths that are contained in the book. She mentions, and this is solid. I think this is a great way to say this. She said that as Christians, we need to recognize that we're being sent out as missionaries. And many of us have heard that over decades. Depending on how long you've been in church, you've probably heard it. But it is saying that we now need to think about actively translating the language, not about going over to another country or ministering to people who are in your country who happen to speak a different language, but that we translate the language of faith into the language of the culture around us. There is very much a sense that we need to translate what happens there between what our world is and as we venture into somebody else's world. We need to change that language. We need to make that accessible. We need to help them to understand what we're saying and where we're coming from, as we like to and really need to. We're called to approach what we do, everything that we do, from a Christian perspective. Pearcey mentions that Darwin completed the naturalistic picture of the universe and isolated value from fact, and now he's ripped those two things apart as we look at the world and how to see the world. And she says, if evolutionary forces produce the human mind, this is Darwin's thought, then religion and morality are not transcendent truths, merely ideas produced by the mind. The idea of objective truth still reigns in science, but not in ethics, not in religion, not in your faith. That the place to talk about truth, objective truth, has to do with science, and only is it verifiable, is it something that we can put numbers to. And she says that the reason that they can do that is because people don't see God as objective. They don't see one unifying theme for the universe. They would see that it's only what's verifiable, only what is testable, and scientific that we need to put our faith in, and not the faith of the Bible. Certainly not the working out of it in modern day Christianity. She says if Christianity is trapped in the upper story, that's the realm of ideas versus the realm of facts. If Christianity's in the upper story, it has nothing to offer. And Christianity is, quote, a comprehensive, unified worldview that addresses all of life and reality. That's the truth. That is the total truth, where she gets the name of the book. And it is not just religious truth, but as she says, it's total truth. Christians must find ways to make it clear that we're making claims about reality, that we're not merely subjective as we talk about our experience. This is not just our feelings, our emotions at play here. This is truth. And that Christianity rests on historical events that are confirmable by empirical evidence. So it is that's the kind of the root of the book there. That's the foundation of the book. I appreciate that she goes through these three steps, these three stages of how we can identify the key parts of a thought system. And she says that there are three things. There is creation, there is fall, and there is redemption. And you'll recognize that as those things are crucial to Christianity. But then she breaks that down a little and says, well, creation is, how is this aspect of the world originally created? What is its original intent and design and purpose? Secondly, the fall, well, how has it been twisted and distorted? That creation, how has it been twisted and distorted by the fall? And how has it been corrupted by sin and false worldviews? The third is redemption. How can we bring this aspect of the world under the lordship of Christ, restoring it to its original creative purpose? And what she does here is takes some of the dominant worldviews that are out there and puts them into that grid. And so that grid of creation, fall, and redemption, I'll let you take a look at how she does this, but she covers the philosophies of Marxism. She covers the work of Rousseau and plugs it into those three steps. She looks at Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, and who was a fan and a proponent of eugenics at that time, and also Buddhism, also New Age movements. And so she looks at in those philosophy systems, those really religious systems, and she breaks that down into those three categories of creation, fall, and redemption. I thought that was so helpful to me to be able to view the world and just get examples of how to look at the world in a certain way with just kind of a new concept, a new framework to be able to take a look at what we see every day and whatever the world bombards us with and the thoughts that are there, the philosophies that are out there. So it is. I think you can tell that I'm highly recommending that you would read this book. It is also one that I think ought to be on many people's shelves. No, I think it ought to be next to your bed to be able to take a look when you have an idea about something, and you're wondering how to process this that you've just come across. You are trying to determine how to make the connection, the bridge between my world and someone else's world. How do we practicalize, if that's a word it is now, that how do we make practical what's coming at us so fast in this world? She says, and she gets to the influence of Christianity, the influence of evangelicalism in the world. She says that evangelicalism is growing theologically broad now to the point of incoherence. We may even be witnessing, she says, the gradual disappearance of doctrine. The style may not be so much distinctively Christian as it is distinctly American. It is the watering down of our faith, of our theology, of our doctrine that is eroding our foundation and really our credibility for being able to speak clearly and being able to speak intelligently into the world in the way that others with different worldviews, with competing worldviews, would see the world. So it is, as she makes the point there, it's so important that we reclaim that we understand, first of all, that we understand what we believe, and we know why we believe what we believe, and then are able to articulate that in a clear and distinctive and again accessible way that people will be able to grab onto. Want to give you kind of some final thoughts on this book. She puts together here within at the end of the book there is the very practical steps there about how do we apply now what we've taken a look at. How do we put this into practice? She has put together here a very rational and understandable description and defense of a Christian worldview. She addresses in that important last section, the kind of the practical section, what it means to Christians and how to live it out. The difficulty is really in the difference between understanding something and both living it out and arguing coherently, again, intelligently for the presence of a Christian worldview in our society. To wrap up here, she says that this book will address the hunger for a Christian worldview that people actually do have. And it offers a new direction for advancing the worldview movement. It's going to help identify the secular and sacred divide. It's going to help you to distinguish that and to keep your faith locked into the private sphere of religious truth. And so that's our tendency to do that. What we want to do is get freed from that distinction and make sure that what we're living out is total truth for everyday living, and that it comes from the scriptures that God has given to us. One last thing actually two things here. One from Tim Challey's, again, who I'll talk about in a moment, but it is, he says, after Pearcey has thoroughly deconstructed our society's postmodern worldview in the first few chapters, he says, I didn't find that I had a clear idea as to how I could rebuild a Christian worldview. He says, maybe this is because there's no, worldview acronym, WORLDVIEU, the EW. There's no Christian acronym for worldview that's there in the 9 points to implementing this. There's not a happy 9-step program to worldview reconstruction, but there are definite steps here. There are definite pegs on which to hang what you believe and to continue to grow those and understand and flesh out what has been taught here in this book. The key really is to acknowledge the deficiency of holding that two-level approach where we have religion or faith over facts, and as almost a separate two-story house, that you would have those that really don't cross over, that it needs to be more fluid, and that our faith would make up that total truth that we have in the way that we address the world. So finally, Al Mohler has said, Al Mohler is the president of the Southern Seminary. He does a podcast that I listen to frequently. He said that Total Truth is one of the most promising books to emerge in evangelical publishing in many years. It belongs in every Christian home and should quickly be put into the hands of every Christian young person. This important book should be part of the equipment for college or university study, and churches should use it as a textbook for Christian worldview development. And so that is his endorsement of that book. So the book is Total Truth, and it is by Nancy Pearcey, subtitled Liberating Christianity from Its Cultural Captivity. I have told you in the past that I will always point this out because it's, to me, the part of the strength of a book that's going to show you these couple of things. One thing that this book has, and Nancy Pearcey says early in the book, that one of her purposes is to not only provide the information, but to also provide you for places to find more of this kind of information, more worldview thoughts and worldview perspectives. So it is a whole section here, about 15 pages worth, and you see very small print, called Recommended Reading. She's going to give you authors, titles of books, where to find them, and a little blurb on each one about why she figures that this book, this resource, is so important for you to look at in terms of developing and maintaining strengthening your Christian worldview. So again, 15 pages. She breaks it down by chapter. If you like the content in chapter 3, you can look at the recommended resources from chapter 3 and find much more information there. And so this book, while what we're trying to do is give you a place where you can say, okay, I now know that I need to read this one book, but this is going to give you lots of books that you probably need to turn to, at least put on a list somewhere, and be working on that list as you read for your pleasure, read for your day-to-day work, and as you try to strengthen and develop your Christian worldview. Another great part of this book is a study guide, and this, again, chapter by chapter breakdown gives you some study questions here. I know of a pastor who took many people in his church through this book, and they had a many weeks long study through this book and used this study guide here to help them to do that. So it has been already implemented in churches. I hope many churches, hope to see many more do that, and so that we will be able to understand what is our total truth, so that we could use the Christian worldview that we already live out of, and that to be honest, most of us need to strengthen anyway, because we are so easily influenced by all the influences that are around us. But if we could take that Scripture as our framework, as our very ground of truth, the foundation of all that we believe, and let that influence every part of our life, this gets closer to what Pearcey calls total truth. I mentioned also Tim Challey's, and I want to tell you, you can just go and spend lots of time there. Whatever time you can give to it, I would heartily recommend that, to look at this resource. This is kind of a podcast within a podcast. I'm going to give you this resource that is about Tim Challey's. He is a pastor, a thinker, an author, a blogger. He's also a dad, which he mentions quite a bit, a husband and father. And so he is his website is Challeys.com. Challeys is spelled Challies, Challeys.com. That's his last name. And he also reviews books. Again, he heartily recommends this book, and he has established an annual reading list that I've tried to work through many times. And it just gives you some ideas of other books that you can be pointed to, and maybe get a broader perspective in your library, and in whatever your Christian perspective is. He has you read books that you would disagree with. He has you read books from certain topics and from certain authors. And so I think you'll find that whole resource there, Challeys.com, very helpful. So that's another resource for you today. Well, thanks for listening to the Church Resource. Please make sure that you give us a review. And if you have any suggestions of resources that you would like us to look at, email us at thechurchresource@gmail.com.